Hello, I'm Darren Grimes and welcome to Reasoned UK, the channel that asks you to think more and follow less. Now, on today's show, first of all, I should remind you to hit that subscribe button and that little notification bell because boy oh boy do we have some absolutely fantastic content lined up for you on this channel that you definitely won't want to miss out on. Some original thinkers and original thought that is coming directly from this channel, so do consider subscribing. Now, on today's show, we're going to explore whether or not the British government is going to ask for an extension to the Brexit transition period. The UK obviously has left the EU, but continues to be in the single market and the customs union, as well as being subject to European rules until the 31st of December. Now, that date is written into law, and it would require Parliament to vote to amend it if Boris Johnson concluded that postponing it until 2021 or even further, God forbid, was required. But does the coronavirus crisis provide a good reason to seek that extension? Most of the press carry items from a slew of continuity Remain campaigners calling upon the Prime Minister to prioritise fighting coronavirus above fighting Brussels. Is this sensible and necessary, or does every deferral of that date of execution give rise to new possibilities to thwart and delay our eventual divergence from Brussels? Let's roll the tape and find out what my fantastic guests think. So joining me to discuss is Victoria Hewson, Head of Regulatory Affairs at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Lance Foreman, a former pro-Brexit member of the European Parliament for London and producer of the best salmon you'll ever have in your life. So hello to both of you.
Hello.
Hi, Darren.
So how's lockdown going for the two of you? Lance, I hear you've been up against it absolutely mad, working round the clock.
It's been interesting. We have, in our core business, about 300 wholesale customers that we deliver to every day. This is, some of the top restaurants, hotels, caterers in London. And sort of mid-March, that suddenly fell off a cliff, and we just lost half our business overnight. But we did have a small sort of home delivery service called Foreman and Field, which was pretty quiet most of the year, but Christmas time it went completely berserk. And we just felt that, this could be our saviour. And we just channeled all our efforts into home delivery because people still have to eat. Whether they eat out at a restaurant or they have restaurant quality food delivered to their homes, they still have to eat. And so that's what we've done. And it's worked very well. It's been challenging because, Christmas, you normally have, a good few months to plan for. Whereas here, we didn't have more than a few days to plan. In fact, you couldn't plan. And supply chains were very difficult because some of our smaller suppliers just decided to pack up because they were encouraged by the furlough scheme, which I think is completely bonkers, to actually close down rather than at least operate on a sort of part capacity basis. So it's been challenging, but, life's like that. And, when we come on to talk about Brexit, nothing's ever certain, and what sorts out successful businesses from unsuccessful ones are those that are able to adapt to changing circumstances, and that's what we had to do.
How are you finding it, Victoria?
Well, I think it's quite striking how quickly I and lots of other people seem to have adjusted to this new rhythm of not having to get up early in the morning and squeeze onto the tube and work a day in the office and then squeeze onto the tube to come home again after a drink at the pub, get back late at night and do it all again. The new rhythm is much more like going for a walk. The day is broken up in completely different ways, and then you get to do your weekly permitted trip to the grocery shop and all these kinds of things. I must admit, I'm not a working from home fan, so I haven't really felt a great boost in my productivity, I have to admit. Hopefully my employers aren't watching. I do prefer working with people around me in the buzz of an office and being able to just have a chat and discuss ideas as you go through the day rather than sitting in a slightly lonely living room.
Well, Victoria, I'm going to put you to work now then, if that's all right. There's lots of talk about an extension of the transition period, and in my view, all too familiar voices calling for it. I've got two questions for you here. If I ask you to sort of put your detective cap on and become Miss Marple for a second, what would be the process of extension, first of all? And secondly, what do you think the actual motives of those calling for said extension actually are?
Well, the process is laid out principally in the withdrawal agreement itself, which provided for us to obviously leave on the 31st of January, which is now done, and then put us into this transition period where basically almost all EU laws continue to apply to us to buy time to negotiate the future relationship. And both sides committed to use their best endeavours to have the future relationship negotiated and agreed to come into force by the end of this year. But there was a recognition that perhaps that might not be possible, and so it was provided that either side could request an extension of that negotiating period by the end of June this year. So this is why we're having this this debate now, because a lot of people are saying, well, look, we're in an extraordinarily challenging situation for businesses. There's so much uncertainty and people are working through so much difficulty anyway. Perhaps we should extend the negotiating period so that businesses won't also be faced with the challenge of adjusting to a new trading relationship with the EU at the end of this year. And that is a plausible argument. It's easy to have sympathy with that argument. Really, leaving the single market and the customs union with or without a deal is quite a big step to do, and various people have commented that in practical terms, for an importing and exporting business who's buying goods and indeed services from the EU and selling goods and services to the EU, the major change comes by leaving the single market and the customs union so that we are a third country. Whether or not you actually have a free trade agreement in place is almost secondary, because the big difference is we will have to fill in all of the importing and exporting formalities and demonstrate compliance with single market rules in a way you don't have to when you're trading from within the single market. So we've got till the end of June to request this extension. In order to do so, of course, as you alluded to before, we would have to change our national law, because in order to head off these calls that we're hearing from various business organisations and commentators to extend the transition period, the government legislated that it would not be lawful for a minister to request an extension. So you would have to introduce primary legislation in the House of Commons, pass an amendment to the Act in order to permit a minister to request an extension. So there's lots of reasons why the government is very keen not to do it. And, lots of reasons why, from a negotiating perspective, it's not a good idea anyway. And perhaps we'll come on to those in a second. But I do think it's quite noticeable that it is largely the same people who argued against leaving the European Union in the first place, and then who argued that we shouldn't then leave the single market and the customs union after that, and then used all of their energies and efforts throughout the Article 50 process to prolong and sort of wreck it, are the same people who are now calling for an extension to the transition period to keep us in EU sort of regulation and sphere of influence for as long as possible.
Yeah, I mean, Lance, if we come to you now, but if we pick up on one recent example, Labour's Rachel Reeves, who now serves in Sir Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet, who was of course architect of Labour's second referendum policy, has warned that if a deal cannot be secured, then the transition period must be extended to avoid the UK crashing out of the EU. This is just daft, isn't it, Lance? Logic. I mean, we could negotiate for 100 years and there wouldn't be a deal unless the EU drops its unreasonable position. All they're doing is pushing the same old ruse to try and stop Brexit altogether.
Well, you're absolutely right. Some people have never come to terms with it, probably never will come to terms with it. But she's out of kilter with Keir Starmer, actually, because Sir Keir has said that he's not going to fight the government on this, and he will not be calling for an extension. What's crazy here is that people are saying that they want, they need extra time so that there can be certainty for business. But what they're saying is they want more uncertainty to get certainty. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I think what's really interesting is, when we were negotiating over the last few years, no one, of course, knew what was going to happen this year with COVID. And it completely puts into perspective how mad all those discussions were, which just dragged on. And, we kept talking about things like frictionless trade. I mean, just look at the effect of COVID on trade, and the amount that we're spending now on bailing out the economy, potentially, hundreds of billions. And there we were arguing about 39 billion to extract ourselves from the EU. So this really does put things into perspective. And what we need to do is we just need certainty. We just need to get it done and dusted. And I think we will. We have a parliament now that wants to get it done. We haven't got John Bercow as Mr. Speaker sort of, putting obstacles in the way. So I think it will happen. But of course, there will be some people that are going to fight it to the end. And, eventually, next year, they will have to come to terms. Although I suspect they will be fighting to have us rejoin. But let's deal with that when we get there.
Absolutely. Victoria, UK government policy at present is strongly against an extension. You alluded to it earlier, but why is that the right approach in your opinion? Isn't there an argument, as Lance just mentioned, with the coronavirus crisis, an extension to get the time and the space to negotiate a good deal could be sensible, right?
Well, unfortunately, that's not really how the Brexit negotiations have worked. The work involved has expanded to fit the timetable, and the timetable has simply been repeatedly extended as soon as there was any risk of anyone having to make a difficult decision. And that hasn't worked in the UK's favour so far. And when you look at what the big points of difference are between the UK and the EU at this time in the process of these negotiations, there's the free trade agreement itself, and the principal sticking point there is the so-called level playing field measures, where the EU has certain demands about the UK signing up to continue to follow EU state aid rules and various other rules around competition policy in perpetuity. They've also stuck in some quite cheeky asks around continuing to adhere to EU regulations on food and agricultural standards. Then we have fishing, which is the EU has basically demanded that they get to keep all of the exact same fishing rights that EU fishermen have today to come into UK territorial waters and continue to fish as of right, which the UK has been resisting. We have the implementation of the Irish Border Protocol, and we have citizens' rights implementation, and the latter two are more about implementation of the withdrawal agreement than actually negotiating the future relationship. And so the question is, would an extension for another 6 months or a year actually help with any of those? And I just don't think that they would. In terms of the future relationship and the trade deal and the level playing field type questions, these are not the kinds of questions that simply need more time to work out the details. I think it was James Forsyth, the Spectator writer, who said, we're not talking about nailing down the definition of prawns here, which you could understand if you're doing a line-by-line negotiation of detailed descriptions of tariff lines and regulations. You can understand why more time might be useful to just get those last details nailed down. We're talking about very high principle matters, which, if the two sides could agree, could be dealt with in an afternoon. So there's no benefit to getting more time to negotiate things where you're so far apart that you could have unlimited. In fact, if you had unlimited time, you still wouldn't, especially if you had unlimited time, you still wouldn't come to a conclusion. And we saw this very much with the Article 50 negotiations, because it was very clear that despite the UK government's messaging to the contrary, that Theresa May was never willing to walk away from the negotiating table. That put us in a very weak negotiating position, and it was very hard to recover from that. So what would it help with? Well, it would help giving businesses more time to prepare, and there are significant changes for businesses that trade with the EU that would come with leaving the single market and customs union. But again, I'm afraid to say, these businesses have had over 4 years now to prepare for this. And because, frankly, the deadline has kept being moved every single time, it feels like we're crying wolf. And businesses, especially the larger businesses who were very successful at lobbying government through institutions like the CBI, frankly, have very little incentive to prepare unless they seriously believe there is a real actual deadline coming that will be adhered to. And frankly, pushing out more and more extensions is not going to help businesses to prepare, because they will still go on hoping and thinking, oh, maybe this time we'll get another extension, so we don't want to waste any more time and money on something that might not happen.
Yeah, Lance, as a business owner, do you share those sentiments?
Well, that's absolutely right. And it's, we're a relatively small business, but we've been around a long time. We've been around for over 100 years. So the vast majority of the years we've operated, we weren't actually in the EU. And then, of course, we joined in the 70s, and now we're coming out of it. But for bigger businesses, I was speaking to one of the large courier companies, director of one of the companies that we work with. And he was saying that, last year when there was a view that we'd end up with a no-deal Brexit, they took on lots of extra people, and they trained them in how to deal with this new situation. And then the negotiations changed, and they thought there was going to be a deal. And then they had to lay them all off, and then they weren't sure whether to retrain. And this is what's causing all the confusion. You can't keep changing what you're going to do the whole time. And this is why people just need certainty. And the great thing about having that 31st December deadline is, you need deadlines to actually crystallize things. And if you keep dragging it on, it's just, it just doesn't help anybody at all. We just have to get on and do it. And that will be, the very fact of doing it will be beneficial for businesses. Yeah.
Victoria, last week we had the latest round of negotiations between the two sides. Michel Barnier, the chief Brexit negotiator of Brussels, and David Frost, who's the UK's chief negotiator, and it didn't go well, I think it's fair to say. Mr. Frost said that once the EU realises the UK will not accept an agreement where the country is bound to its laws and standards, the conversation could progress. I think many people watching this today will be thinking, well, absolutely fair enough. What does the EU not understand about being an independent nation state once again? And Monsieur Barnier said that the round we have just had is disappointing, very disappointing. And this week there have been some rumours that the EU might be preparing to change its position on fishing rights. But, just how far apart are the two sides, Victoria? What are the big points of difference? And what actually is the EU asking for on fishing that's so unsavoury to the UK's negotiating team?
So that round of negotiations last week, and the statements that the two chief negotiators made at the end of it was pretty frosty, no pun intended. And Michel Barnier in particular seemed to be really quite annoyed and angry that things weren't going his way. And he was trotting out the line that we had quite a lot in the Article 50 negotiations about how the UK was asking for all the benefits of being an EU member but wasn't willing to accept the obligations and basically admit the fact that we were leaving the EU, so we couldn't still benefit from frictionless trade, etc. Now, at the time, under Theresa May's negotiating strategy, that was kind of not unfair. She was trying to basically replicate the single market from outside of the EU. However, the current negotiating strategy really isn't trying to do that at all. And in fact, it's more like the EU trying to continue to impose all of the burdens of membership on us without corresponding sort of benefits of, for example, having a vote on the rules and a voice in their enforcement. And this is definitely the case in fisheries, where what the UK wants is to have an arm's length relationship similar to what non-EU countries like even Norway and Iceland, in terms of the EU's neighbours, have, where you basically negotiate available quotas on a rolling, I think it's done annually. You negotiate the quotas of UK fishing stocks that EU fishermen will be able to access. The EU fishermen, especially in countries like the Netherlands, France, Denmark as well, I think, really rely very heavily on their access to UK fishing waters for their catch. And if they will not be able to fish in the way that they do at the moment in UK waters, that's a serious blow to them. So it's quite an important, although it's quite a narrow issue in that it doesn't really affect most member states or most of the economies of the EU. For those people who are affected in those countries and regions of those countries, it's a very, very big issue. And there's been a lot of concern in UK fishing communities who had got their hopes up that we might be able to remedy some of what they see as the great unfairness of how the common fisheries policy has worked out for them. There's been some anxiety that because fishing is such a relatively small part of the UK economy, that it will be very tempting for Gove and Frost to trade off our fishing waters for something better that is seen to be more important, like financial services access. So there have been those rumblings that the EU might adjust its position on fisheries and maybe some horse trading happening around there. But, you know, the main point that's really sticking in terms of the free trade agreement is this issue about a level playing field, which the EU is obsessed about. They're saying if you want access to our market, if you want tariff-free access to our market, you must agree that you won't subsidise your businesses and you won't do unfair anti-competitive practices that will disadvantage our businesses. That's not unfair. And all free trade agreements have provisions in them that deal with that, where parties agree that they won't unreasonably subsidise their businesses in a way that would unreasonably disadvantage the competitors in the other country. But what nobody agrees to in a free trade agreement is to wholesale copy the other party's rules and regulations and submit to the other party's judges in deciding when there's been a breach or not. That's just insane. And the EU, I think they know they're being pretty unreasonable about that. What we should be looking for, what the UK is looking for, is that we would agree on an arm's length basis in an international agreement that we will have anti-subsidy and competition law in this country. If the EU feels that we are breaching that and we are causing distortions and disadvantages unfairly to their producers, they can put tariffs against that in order to redress the balance again. That's how it would normally work in an international trade agreement. And that's where the UK, we must stick to our guns on that. It's really important.
Well, Lance, Sir James Dyson in the Sunday Times this week called for the UK to do just that, stick to its guns. He argued this is very much a commercial, it should be viewed as a commercial negotiation instead of one, you know, with your mates down the road, which I think was the approach of Theresa May. Do you think the government is getting this right, and do you think sticking to our guns should absolutely be the message?
Absolutely. You know, we have to stay firm, and we have to get it done for a number of reasons. You know, first of all, every month we continue, we're paying them £1 billion. You know, and you know, we're paying them £1 billion, and they set rules which we have no control over. So that is just the first and very obvious reason that we have to end the transition on the date that's been set. The second reason is that, you know, we are looking to form free trade agreements with other countries around the world, with the USA, with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and so on. And we cannot sign those free trade agreements whilst we're still in the EU. So we need to actually get, we do more trade around the rest of the world, and our trade is growing around the rest of the world where it's not within the EU. So it's in the real interest of the economy to get those free trade deals signed as quickly as possible. And actually, the further down the road we go with those trade agreements, the more pressure it helps in the negotiations with the EU, because they realise that we really don't need them. So it's important that we stay firm for that reason too. And of course, the third reason is, we do want to, or we do need to, I should say, reassess our regulations. And whilst we are still in the EU, we are tied to EU regulations, even in the transition period. And I'm not saying that all our regulations are going to suddenly change overnight. In fact, we're replicating all EU regulations from day one. But we do need to start reviewing them, and we need a whole change of mindset within our own civil service. We need a deregulation mindset because, our economy is, it's really suffering at the moment, particularly with COVID. And the way to get the economy going again is A, by having a tax policy that drives private sector growth, and B, you need to deregulate as far as possible. You need to free up businesses so that they can actually grow. And so for all of those three reasons, I think there are three crucial reasons. We have to just stay firm with this, with the date. I do feel some sympathy for the EU because they're in a complete catch-22. If we do well having left the EU, there's really no other reason for any other country to be part of the EU. And the other countries are watching our negotiations very carefully. And if we do badly because the EU try and punish us in some way, then they're going to be cutting off their nose to spite their face, and the EU is going to suffer really badly too. So Barnier's, his position is, I don't envy his position, but we have to stay firm throughout this, and I think the government will do.
Yeah, you've noticed it's very funny actually, the messaging coming out of Brussels at the moment. It's such a switch from the rhetoric that the UK was once saying about Brussels' position, about their, running down the clock, etc., etc. And now we are the ones that seem to hold more chips in our favour. It's almost like that's what we should have done to begin with. But hey ho, there's no point crying over spilt milk. Victoria, if there's no extension, will the government and businesses, you did touch on this slightly, but will they be ready for leaving the single market and the customs union at the end of this year, or with or without, that is, a free trade agreement? And is there still a big chance to actually get that preparation underway if we know where we're going to be at by the end of June? And Theresa May's former special advisor on Europe has penned a piece for Politico calling for a preparation, ratification and engagement period, or PrEP he's called it in short. And he argues that this time would be used for the UK and the EU governments to engage with businesses on how to implement the deal for all involved to prepare for the coming changes and for the final ratification steps to be taken. Do you think that's necessary as well?
Well, yeah, so Raoul Reparel's piece is quite interesting because he's proposing that we could agree an extension with the EU that would only come into effect if we have agreed a deal by the end of December. And so the extension would be an implementation period for businesses to get their heads around what has been agreed and be able to implement it. That's quite an interesting little solution. I still don't think it's very desirable because what we have to recall, as Lance alluded to, being in the transition period for the UK is very undesirable. It costs us money. It costs us, it comes at the cost of our democracy and accountability of institutions. And also, an important point is that the extension itself would have to be negotiated. We don't get it as of right just by asking. The EU would extract a price for that. And given that they've just agreed themselves, amongst themselves yesterday, a 500 billion euro fund to support the member states in the post-corona recovery, you can see where this would be heading in terms of the UK making more financial contributions. Perhaps not specifically towards that, but there would certainly be a financial price to pay for any extension period. So I'm still quite wary of that kind of solution. In terms of business readiness, first of all, I think it's really important to recall that the vast majority of businesses in this country do not trade with the EU at all. So the number of businesses who are actually going to be required to adjust their processes to be able to satisfy the formalities and potentially have to pay tariffs is relatively small. So that's why HMRC can be quite focused in the support that they give to these businesses. And I would say, in fairness, that at the moment there probably hasn't been enough. The readiness programme that was underway in the Article 50 process was stood down as soon as the deal the withdrawal agreement was agreed, while we were negotiating the future relationship in the transition period. And we're only now getting more information through, for example, Liz Truss, the Secretary of State for International Trade, published just this morning what will be the UK's baseline tariffs that will apply on our imports from the rest of the world and will apply on our imports from the EU if we don't agree a deal. So this kind of thing is very useful, that businesses can start to get a picture of what their no deal situation might look like. There's also something called a customs academy that HMRC are funding and supporting to try and help businesses to train up their personnel who will need to get familiar with and qualified in making customs declarations and dealing with customs compliance. And it has to be said, at the moment, the uptake on that scheme hasn't been that great. And this is partly because there's this rolling assumption by business that something will come along and they won't have to deal with it, and they don't want to spend time and money if it might never happen. So hopefully, as June passes and there is no extension agreed, those kinds of schemes will see much better uptake. Frankly, it's the kind of thing that you could easily see businesses who've got employees on furlough could set them off away on these training schemes. I think that's allowed if you're on furlough to do training schemes. So it would be an ideal opportunity for businesses that are in a really slow phase at the moment and have got people on furlough at the taxpayer's expense. Why not send them on some customs training programs at this customs academy? And finally, most vitally of all, I have to say, the most important thing is for HMRC and Border Force to get their systems and processes working, because the only way this is going to work, and especially as between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the only way that's going to work is if we have a really slick, very simplified set of processes for traders to use. And that's something that will benefit our trade with the rest of the world and would broadly be very good for the whole economy if we really turbocharged our trading capabilities.
Yeah, Lance, I mean, Victoria touched there on the fact that the UK government this morning has announced its UK global tariff, which will be the UK's most favoured nation tariff. These sorts of things coming forward, there just needs to be more of them, doesn't there, to ensure that businesses can be ready and prepared?
They can do. Look, on tariffs, it's just, it's basically a sort of pricing mechanism. When you're living in an economy that has its own independent currency, prices are moving up and down all the time. If you look at the devaluation of the pound since 2016, I mean, that's been brilliant for exporters. That's been a real bonus. So, businesses adjust to that all the time. One thing I would say, going back to your previous discussion about government sort of helping businesses through all this, is that there's always a gap between the theory and the practical reality. And not that long ago, we had a government minister here, and he was saying to me, so tell me about your experiences in exporting and importing, and what problems do you come across? And because it's something we do all the time, we're able to advise government ministers, because what you read, on the websites and the textbooks aren't necessarily what actually happens in practice. And what I would say is that the profit motive is the best incentive of all to make sure that businesses get things right. If when we start, trading with the EU, having, fully left and transition period ends, a business like mine might export, we export to Italy at the moment, and of course that we might need to fill in a form. If we fill in the form and the goods get held up and the customs officer across the channel says, you need to fill in this box slightly differently, we won't get it wrong the second time. You learn by doing, and that's what happens in reality. So it's all very well having all these sort of instructions coming through from government. Businesses learn by doing, and as I say, the profit motive is the thing that makes sure they don't get things wrong too often.
Yeah. Victoria, we saw the immigration bill as well yesterday before Parliament. I wonder, I'll put this out to both of you, what did you make of it? Because obviously it suggests we are leaving the EU, it suggests free movement of people will come to an end, it suggests that ball is rolling, and that finally, I think, many of the British public out there will have an immigration policy that has almost unanimous support. This is one issue where people have been crying out for the government to actually be the ones in the driving seat of who it does and doesn't come to this country. Were you delighted to see that, Lance?
Look, it is, as you say, it's a milestone, but for me, immigration was never my big issue. So, obviously for a lot of people it is. I think that one of the reasons why it's become such a big issue is because of things like pressure on housing and so on. But we might find in our new COVID world there are going to be so many changes in the way people behave and the way the economy works, and people working from home and less commuting and so on. You might find that actually has a larger effect on the way we live our lives. The world is always changing, the economy is always changing, and as I say, that is one step to dealing with Brexit. But whether it's crucial or not, I just don't know.
Victoria?
Yeah, I think I'd say that I welcome the principle that the UK now has sovereignty over immigration policy. I think that is important. In terms of the substance, I'm not particularly close to the substance of what the policy has actually ended up being as set out in the bill. I think for me it's most important now that the policy is clear, transparent and fairly administered, so that we don't get any more of the succession of disasters that have had horrible consequences for many people through Home Office errors in the recent past. So a clear, transparent, fairly administered process is really important. And I think we need to also, the immigration side of it is only, as Lance alluded to, one side of people's concerns. There were also concerns around jobs and training and homes that also need to be addressed. And I'm afraid if the government think that by taking back control of immigration and introducing a points-based immigration policy, all of the problems that people face in terms of getting vocational training and being able to afford a nice home for themselves and their family to live in, then I think they'll be sadly mistaken.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, we've covered quite a lot of ground now. So to end, could I have you both summarise why 2020 is the year to be fully out of the EU's regulatory orbit, and why actually you're optimistic, if you are indeed optimistic, I don't want to put words into your mouth, about our chances outside of it, and actually why COVID-19 means it's even more urgent that we do so and not less. I'll start with you, Lance.
Well, you have to look at both the positive and the negative, and my view hasn't changed now from how it's been the last few years. I believe that the EU has passed its use-by date, And the world has changed now. We trade now, just on a computer like we're speaking now. You don't have to travel to the place. The geography is really far less important than it ever was. The world has moved on, and the opportunities are global. And you don't necessarily need to be geographically right next door to a trading partner to trade with them. So I think the opportunities are there, and we can see that because we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years where our growth is coming from, and it's not on our doorstep, it's much further afield. But I think there's also dangers in the EU, and I think we have to be very careful about those dangers, and that they are all driven by the dysfunctionality of the single currency, a currency that could never work for Germany and Greece. And I think that the pressure that we're now seeing put upon the EU economy through COVID and the bailout that's going to need is really exacerbating that situation. And I personally think, and I've thought this for a long, long time, but I think that the time is going to come where that thing is just going to go, it's going to go pop. And we don't want to be close, and we don't want to be tied to it when that happens. I mean, the whole world will be affected by it. But it would be much better for the EU and, I would say for other EU countries to see our departure from the EU in a well-managed and unchaotic manner, and for them to follow our lead, rather than to wait until such time as the euro currency goes pop and there is chaos across Europe. And I think that's, for me, that is, really one of the biggest issues here.
Victoria?
Yeah, I'm optimistic as well. I think the UK outside of the EU will be in a much better position in many ways to overcome the current crisis and thrive and grow. As a sort of counterpoint to Lance's points about the difficulties that the EU is in, however, I would also say from our domestic perspective, we can't be complacent. And we in this country are equally capable of having governments making terrible economic and other policy decisions. So we can't get complacent. We have to keep on scrutinizing the decisions that our government's making, both in terms of how they're dealing with all of the support in this current coronavirus crisis, and also, more generally, how our regulations will work in the future, how our tax policy will work in the future. That's all on us now. Governments don't get to blame the EU for things anymore, and we as voters have to really be keeping a close eye and asking the right questions about these things going forward now.
Absolutely, and hey, I've no doubt in my mind whatsoever that the two of you will be doing just that. So thank you very much for joining Reasoned today.
Thank you.
Now,
Thank you.
I'm sure you'll agree with me that was an absolutely fascinating discussion, and you'll be eager to hit that subscribe button and leave us a comment below. Thank you very much for joining. Reasoned is a grassroots organisation that relies on support from people like yourself who want us to continue producing our free-thinking, high-quality content. You can rest assured whatever you donate, big or small, will be put back into ensuring we win the battle of ideas. Thank you for your support.